members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
No, I don't know to the second one. We have a responsibility to report in the stock, on the stock, but I'm not familiar with that 5-month review, but if people aren't reporting, they should be.
Why should they be banned?
Because this is a free market and we're a free market economy, they should be able to participate in that.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Left Reckoning 49. I'm very happy to be here. We're talking Dems, insider trading, and the end of mass politics. We'll be joined in just a couple minutes by our friend and comrade, Daniel Bessner, who's going to be talking about a great piece that he wrote in the Foreign Exchanges called The End of Mass Politics. And in a little bit, we're going to be joined by another old friend and comrade, Djene Bajalan, who's going to help us break down exactly what's going on in Turkey. Just wanted to do a special shout out. Hopefully this is working, but I think this might be our first stream available on Rockfin. So for all the people who are listening and watching over there, welcome to Left Reckoning. Before we get too much further on, man, how's it going, brother? How you doing, Matt?
It's going pretty okay. I'm pretty much all recovered from my bout of Omicron syndrome. Look, ready to get rocking on the new year of Left Reckoning to a new audience. Welcome, Rockfin
welcome.
folks.
Yeah, seriously, and I, hope that we're live on the platform. We'll find out soon if we are or not. But beyond that, later in the show, we're going to be going to the post game, which is the members only section of this program. And for this one, we're going to finally be able to have people call in. This week, they're going to be leaving voicemails. Hopefully, very soon we'll be able to do a kind of live call-in show. But if you're already a patron, you should be able to call and leave voicemails in advance, and we'll be answering those in the post game. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff we want to get to. Later in the show, we're also going to be doing a little bit of left-wing history. We like to root ourselves a little bit here at Left Reckoning. Before we get too far, we want to open up the show by talking about wealth and power. Wealth and power, more often than not, go hand in hand. And in the case of our U.S. Congress, these are some of the wealthiest people in the country. Nancy Pelosi is no exception to that. We talked a lot on this show about how, the super rich and billionaires have made a killing over this pandemic. The rich have done well. They've done very, very well. But there's another group that is doing well, and it shouldn't surprise you that it's politicians. And can we pull up this first graph here, Matt?
Yes.
This was a bit that was put out by an interesting group called Unusual Whales, which sort of is monitoring what's going on with stock trading with people in Congress. And this is a list of folks who in 2021, just this last year, who beat the stock market average, right? You see at the top is congratulations, Georgia's Austin Scott, Brian Mast, French Hill, John Curtis, Lil Dan Crenshaw, holding up the rear of the Republicans, followed very, very closely by Miss Nancy Pelosi.
Miss Nancy Pelosi herself. Now, David, your understanding when people beat the market, is that something that is, possible over time to do with regularity without, say, like something like inside information?
It'd be pretty damn hard. And the reason that not just this group, but other people actually watch people like Nancy Pelosi very, very closely is because she has a very long history of doing extremely well on the stock market and, making pretty puzzling calls that would be difficult for somebody just sort of watching the market as an outsider. If you could pull up this piece in Jackman by Ryan Zigraff, who is by the way, he writes for Jackman, but also runs a really great site also called Third Rail, which you should definitely be checking out. He breaks down basically why day traders are so obsessed with Nancy Pelosi. And it's one of these things where the reason that people are very obsessed with her is because it's a pretty damn sure bet. If you scroll down, we can go to this bit that starts to understand. To understand how Pelosi became a Wall Street mega influencer, just look at the numbers. Since last year, she and her husband, Paul Pelosi, traded over $50 million in assets with an annualized return at 69% as of October, according to an estimate from the Nancy Pelosi Portfolio Tracker. That's higher than Buffett, George Soros, Cathie Wood, and other star investors of the past. Members of Congress aren't required to provide an exact figure for the value of their assets, but Pelosi's wealth grew by an estimated $16.7 million in 2020, just as millions of Americans fell into poverty and struggled to make ends meet during the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, 2021 is shaping up to be even nicer for Nancy. And as we noted in that first piece with the unusual whales, yes, 2021 was a very, very good time for her. This is the important bit right here. This is where, when Nancy Pelosi, we played this at the very top of the show, when she says that she does not think that members of Congress should be restricted in their ability to trade, other than just the kind of very basic reporting requirements. It's very telling that she says we live in a free market system, we live in a capitalist system, because she wants to, one, not only be able to fatten up her bank account, but she likes the role that she has as somebody who has a lot of influence with these companies as a member and a leader in Congress, but also somebody who has vast amounts of money invested in them. This bit right here is really critical. Social media users started to take sharper notice of her trading prowess in July when Paul exercised a call option move that let him buy 4,000 shares of Google's parent company Alphabet, right before the House Judiciary Committee voted on antitrust regulations for Silicon Valley monopolists. Ka-ching! The move meant $5.3 million more for the Pelosi's to add to their estimated $100 million plus fortune. At that time, top Democrats, Pelosi included, squawked about the need for new federal regulations to hold the big four, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, to account. Yet they've dragged their feet on bills to strengthen privacy and encourage competition in the months since then. Meanwhile, more than 2/3 of Pelosi's stock transactions since 2020 have included those tech giants. I mean, simply put, in any other context, I feel like most people would be able to call that what it is, which is insider trading. It's acting with particular interests, and you can have the theater, right? You can talk about how you're wanting to put more regulation on these companies, but if you start to have a vested financial interest in the growth and those successes of those companies, that puts you in direct conflict with your responsibility to American democracy, to American voters. And it's something that just does not seem to bother people like Nancy Pelosi, who is not alone in the Democratic Party, by the way, in trading. Obviously, the Republicans sort of outdo them. But she is very happy to be leading the pack when it comes to profiting from her position and her influence, and most importantly, her knowledge as to what Congress is going to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing I find more alienating than this sort of like engaging in this passive income. This is the free market where you're basically just betting on the actual real world and getting huge returns on that just for like owning stock, just for owning stuff. And that's the right way you're supposed to do it. That's the way, like, if you get a little bit of money spent, like there's nothing more depressing when I've heard like different people come into money because of a death or something like that. And it's like the responsible thing to do with this is to start gambling it into and trying to teach myself like how to pick winners. And of course, the responsible thing is like, and I've never had the money to do this, but like just put into index funds. But now it's like we have all these other options, like, cryptocurrencies or just actual this sort of thing where I'm going to follow what Nancy Pelosi does. And that's actually like, from a survival standpoint, that's actually a decent strategy to be following, and it's really disgusting.
I feel like, oh Lord, sorry about that. I was hoping that was going to let me pull this up. Jesus,
make an image for us. Express yourself.
Well, I was hoping. Let me see what happens if I do this. Okay, there we go. It just wasn't zoomed out. I just wanted to, we like to root ourselves in history here on Left Reckoning, and I wanted to note a quote from Eugene Debs, which I think, it speaks much more to the the kind of absurdity of our system, and to in the ways that certain people are able to, enjoy mass amounts of wealth without really working for it, more so than necessarily the kind of political corruption I think that Pelosi's engaged in. But this is a great quote from Eugene Debs, that he said actually before he was going to be brought into prison for opposing the imperialist war, World War I. I'm opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. And that's Eugene Debs right there.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be the case that you have to. That's the response. It just depresses me that that's the responsible thing. Is we got to bet in instead of just assuring people like retirements. Like what? Like it's like the Reese Witherspoon tweet about how everyone's going to have a digital wallet and NFT and a parallel digital identity. Are you planning for this? And I don't know.
You shouldn't be.
Yeah, but good on certain members of Congress who are saying that we should actually stop this thievery and just blatant credibility busting. We'll see. I read a book called Parliament Inc. that the UK is right there with us as far as just how this stuff is basically bought and sold. These politicians are bought and sold.
Yeah. No, I mean it's an old tale. I mean, sometime later, there's a really great Engels quote about the American party system, how it's just sort of like two competing cartels trying to use the office to profit themselves and their friends. And it's unfortunately just as true as it was in 1890 as it is today.
And I know we got to get to Danny, but like the thing is like when you see people tell a story about like, oh, I could have invested in Google stock back in this year and I could have this much money, like what people like have divorced money from like, oh, this means I can like compel labor to the tune of like several millions of dollars just for having made the right bet. And it shouldn't be something that, people applaud.
No, certainly not. And again, the reason people are following it is because it's a pretty sure bet, because she has information that other people don't. But yeah, I think that you're 100% right on the morality of it. But y'all, we're going to pop off the screen for just 1 second. And we're going to come back right back with Danny Bessner. We're going to talk about the great piece that he wrote in Foreign Exchange called The End of Mass Politics. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Djene Bajalan. And after that, we're going to go back to another period in the late 19th century and talk about the great fence-cutting wars of Texas.
The enclosure of the commons, folks. More and more people are talking about how horrible it was for a lot of the small folks. So
exactly. I will be right back, y'all. All right, everybody, welcome back. Matt, you put on this this thing on the bottom. Could you get rid of it? There's a YouTube comment on the bottom of the screen.
Oh, is there?
Yeah, I'm not able to get rid of that because you clicked on it. But
I didn't know I clicked.
No, we're using a new system. I appreciate everyone's patience as we sort of deal with some of the bugs. No worry. I mean, it's a good quote. But all right. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to be joined right now by Daniel Bessner. Daniel Bessner is somebody who you can find in many, many places. Jacobin, the Great American Prestige podcast, and also writing in Foreign Exchange, among many, many other things. How you doing, Danny?
Good, man. How are you guys?
Dude,
doing
it's
great. Don't forget hinge points with
Yes,
Lord
Lord.
Matt Christmas.
How could
Yeah,
I?
I'm
It's in the Chapo feed. Check that out. I'm
exactly
sure everyone
like,
listening has checked that out. Thank you.
yeah. It's nice of you to help them out. They're struggling for content over there.
No, I mean, for people who aren't familiar, I'm sure most of y'all are. Danny was also a very dear member of the TMBS crew, so it's always great to have these reunion shows. And happy for you. I mean, this is a second or third time over here with us on Left Reckoning so far, so you're making your appearances here too.
Yeah, of course. Happy to come on whenever.
Well, I had you on. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different things we could talk about, but you had this piece that you put up, and if Matt, you could put this on the screen for everybody. In Foreign Exchange, which is a great Substack that y'all should be following, called "The End of Mass Politics," and I'll just read out the first bit of it. If Americans feel disconnected from their government and their communities, perhaps that's because they are. If social media is any indication, and despite what people might say or hope, it is very much the major feelings experienced by most Americans are dislocation and unease. In the last 20 years, the U.S. government has lurched from failure to failure to the point where a repetition of American-led disasters, Afghanistan, Iraq, Katrina, the Great Recession, Libya, Trump, reads like a negative doxology. After living through Washington's inability and or unwillingness to address adequately the COVID-19 pandemic, either at home or abroad over the past 2 years, many Americans have resigned themselves to a reality in which their lives are getting and will continue to get worse. Could you start... just to help us all understand so we're on the same page, what you mean by mass politics and what you mean by sort of ending?
Sure. So if you look at what's generally taken to be the start of our own era, let's say the post-World War I period, you see the rise of a number of things like the radio, things like very cheap printing presses and methods of distribution, mass political parties that are meaningfully similar to what exists today. Lots of differences too, but meaningfully similar. And it was the age of the masses. Now, if you go back to the late 19th century, people are already talking about the masses, but the general take is that, the modern era that we exist in today really began in the 1920s, and one of the defining characteristics of that era was this thing that we call mass politics, where people listen to mass things like the radio, or people engage in mass political organizing, or mass protests, or mass propaganda events like the Nuremberg rallies, where you see masses of people, they come together and they have a meaningful relationship to politics. I think that the actual history of the United States since World War II, and beginning during World War II, really has been a successful attempt to basically disconnect people from power. And one of the elements of that was essentially removing political authority from the demos, or the public, or the people. And that was it started first in the most important areas, which, or at least the areas viewed as most important by the American state: foreign policy and macroeconomic policy, which most people have not most people, ordinary people have no say on. And you had things like the creation of new institutions within the actual state, the CIA, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Department of Defense in the late 1940s. And at the same time, you had the parallel creation of think tanks and the network of think tanks, and what are referred to as parastatal organizations, organizations that serve state functions, but are not officially connected to the state, even though they're mostly funded by the state. And you could say for things like weapons manufacturers, right? They create weapons for sale abroad, but also they do quite a bit for the United States government. And one can meaningfully say, like, these are things that the government should do. And so over the course of the last, 40 or 50 years since the 1970s, you've had the increasing, what Daniel Rogers calls the age of fracture, the coming apart of a lot of our social base. Like, bowling alone, all those arguments about, the dislocation, the alienation of American life caused by things like the development of suburbs, which are really a product of the 50s and onward, caused by, the focusing on the car as this ideal of American masculinity, the creation of the interstate highway system, which allows you to have these cars, the creation of the suburbs, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this increasing alienation of American life. plus the sort of power structure that I described a little bit earlier. Then you have in the last 5-10 years, and particularly on the left, what I would call a fetishization of protest, the fetishization of mass movement. But I would say that if you look at what has actually happened empirically, there's been and also I should add earlier, of course, the decline of labor unions, which were never super high in the United States. And the United States always had more right-wing labor unions than comparative places in Europe. But, there's still the labor had a seat at the table. And that was a real thing. And that has obviously declined in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So what you have today is that people basically arguing in favor of particular political strategies like mass protests. And I think we saw in the summer of 2020, some of the largest mass protests in history, certainly in American history, probably in world history, particularly repeated and ongoing, et cetera. But you haven't seen a corresponding change in the actual politics or an actual policy. You have people talking about politics all the time on Twitter. And in real life, oftentimes, there's a well-documented partisan sorting of the parties where liberals are now Democrats and conservatives are now Republicans. So people talk about politics all the time, but there seems to be almost no connection between any sort of discussion and actual policy change. You have this network of, where we're all part of, the constant podcasts, more people talk and think about politics in a sense. It's part of their entertainment diet and probably at any other time in human history, but there seems to be no effect on political change. And I think that's one of the reasons is because we have and then my final thing is that I think like everyone's going a little nuts these days. I think that's pretty clear, and that's due to COVID, but that's also due to a lot of things, the end of Birdie, 2008, et cetera. But one of the reasons I think people are kind of losing their minds is that there's a ontological disconnect between talking and thinking about nothing but politics and seeing nothing change and seeing Chuck Schumer tweet, get rid of student loans, Biden, or whatever it may be. And so I think what we need to do is really like think if these mass metaphors, the metaphors of the masses or the literal strategy of the masses really make sense for how power is operationalized in our actually existing society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summary, especially of where we're at now, and I'm really happy to have you on because like this is the kind of question that I've been wrestling with, for a while, like both on the show and also with Michael on TMBS. Like, okay, so we can see that people have like a lot of personal passion, but I think a lot of people have a difficulty sort of imagining what politics like actually looks like, right? Rather than it just sort of being a space of like individual expression. But before we even get to like sort of critiquing everybody for being too online on that kind of stuff, like I wanted to note another part of like the social decline though that you were mentioning earlier. When you do look at the historical difference in this country, I think one thing you can really see right now, and something that the right wing is taking a lot of advantage of, is the relationship that people feel to all institutions but especially ones that are supposedly like democratically controlled, like the whole CRT freak out and the stuff that's going on at school boards, right? You listen to the way that people are talking and you don't see this kind of democratic, feeling of like pride or control over the school system. They talk about the school system as if it's something that's sort of imposed, top down on them rather than it being something that's sort of community or socially owned, right? I don't know. You compare that to some of the earlier parts of American history, people sort of had an understanding of like the public space as something where we could like interact with, when people are going and interacting with it, they're not treating it as it's something that's like collectively owned by us. It's something that's sort of been put upon them that they're resisting now. Right.
Yeah. And I think you see there was a really good piece that came out in the New Republic around the time of Occupy. I forgot the name of the author, but that discussed the increasing privatization of private space, like Zuccotti Park was privatized, and so then you have just sort of this demassification sort of trickling down from decisions elites made about the American state and decisions, they made macroeconomic decisions without essentially consulting the American people and contributed to these dislocations. And so I think what you're describing is exactly part of the process that I'm talking about here as well.
Yeah, and it's just difficult, to start to build a roadmap for the way out of it, because it's something that I try to note on this show a lot too. Is that like, yeah, as you're saying, like the creeping of like private space over public space is something that plays a huge role in this. I mean, it's sort of like a Twitter meme now, but it is a very like viable and important argument. People, like show a picture of like their downtown area and you know, say like, show me where I can hang out for free, right? And you start to see how that's very disappearing, even in urban centers, let alone if you're like the vast majority of Americans now who lives in a kind of like suburban area. I mean, there's nothing truly, you know, there's very little around us that we can sort of engage in, just like public space walking around. But like social organizations, like this is a big part of neoliberalization, is not just removing people from like, you know, state power, but also removing us from like, you know, social lives in general. Right. I mean, like we really are living in my opinion, in like the realization of the Thatcher era. And I feel like COVID has, you know, really made this worse in the sense that when Thatcher says like there is no society, there's individuals in the family, right? More and more people being sort of stuck at home really does feel like a kind of dark realization of the Thatcherite dream. And we're seeing that under, under in a period of time when, you know, early Biden administration, it was like, neoliberalism is over. We're entering into a new age, right? We really, in a lot of ways, have entered into like a true encapsulation of a lot of the neoliberal principles.
Yeah, and I think that's because, as I put in the article, I think capitalism is one. I mean, and you guys mentioned hinge points. You know, in a certain sense, I think like what people were actually talking about in the 19th century was not like a social democracy or what the Soviet Union became. Right? They were talking about genuine, total new organization of society led by people who are not alienated from their labor and who control the levers of power democratically. And that dream died relatively early in the 20th century. So we're kind of living in that aftermath. And so we're seeing like what capitalism does without even an ideological rival in the Soviet Union. And we could talk about what the Soviet Union was or what it wasn't, but it was certainly perceived as an anti-capitalist ideological rival, and to some degrees it was. But absent that, you're seeing capitalism on steroids, and this is what we get. But the problem is no one believes in anything. There's no other ideological alternatives. So you have this malaise where people just basically become obsessed with like the processes of democratic politics and like bureaucratic organization, which is wild. I mean, it's not interesting, and it's in a sense not properly political. Even engaging in that, you're engaging in the fact that it is that it is, you know, like by focusing on the technical and the sort of progress elements, you're actually engaging in the type of end of history rhetoric about the questions of politics have been decided, and it's all technical. And I think you see it with sort of like the played out extremism that is, you know, reflected online, which I think, I mean, I disagree with people. I think Twitter is online, particularly when so many of our of real life. I think that when particularly because so much of our life is mediated through social media, Twitter or another thing. But the problem is real life is we don't affect shit. So just like on Twitter, we don't affect shit because in real life, we don't affect shit. And I'll end on this one. I mean, voting is also like a very weak form of democracy. It's choosing which people rule you. You know, this is a very impoverished understanding of democracy. It's been dominant in this country since the 1930s. So like even our like great, you know, democratic imagination is like we get to choose which aristocrats rule us in a sense, becoming increasingly aristocratic. So yeah, it's a pretty grim moment. And I think we need to think our way out of here.
I mean, you know, we all love Daddy Bernie, right? Because he certainly changed the game. You know, but this is a point that I've been making time and time again. Is like every once in a while he would hint at this, right? Where he would say, you know, obviously the slogan "It's not me, us" is great, but when he would expand on that, and he would say, "What I mean by that is if I come into power and I want to do any of the things that I'm running on, I'm going to need like mass mobilization of society." And I think that analysis is correct in the way, like to be able to challenge the state, you know, power, like that is what we would need. But it's sort of laughable to say it at that point, because I'm sorry, in 2020 we were nowhere close to that being like, you know, I'm sorry, I'd have a hard time imagining Bernie winning either 16 or 20. Just unfortunately, I try to be an optimist, but I'm a little pessimist on that. But even if we did win, I feel like it would have been a very disappointing experience, right? Because Bernie Sanders coming up against this like very, very powerful state, without having these kind of like mass movements that are capable of like using the social power of people. We were nowhere close to having that developed. And, you know, maybe we could do it quickly. I don't know. But I feel like that sort of left a lot of people in a state of confusion, right? Because the closest that a lot of people felt coming to political change were these, you know, primary campaigns within the Democratic Party, which is not our party, and was trying to do everything it could to sort of derail and destroy these from within. So I feel like one of the difficult things that we have right now is like, again, it's not just that we don't have the structures that we need. I think a lot of people have a hard time imagining what those structures would actually need to be
Right.
able to
And so,
implement change.
well, it's not even so like to me, capital has been enormously successful about reformulating labor relations to the point where the
Mm.
sociality and solidarity upon which any sort of organization relies is basically impossible. You know, if you're working for Uber or you're working for Uber Eats or whatever, any one of these gig economy jobs, you're hyper alienated. You don't even
Hmm.
have a workplace. You have several different bosses, which are really just computers who are not even your bosses. And so that sort of sociality
Hmm.
upon which any organization relies is basically impossible. And so I think the left, broadly speaking, oftentimes just says organize. Okay, how? And this is why I think you see a lot of the large organization efforts happening at the few places where there is that sort of sociality, at an Amazon warehouse, at a Starbucks, at a graduate school, you know,
Mm.
these centralized places where people come and actually meet. And that'll be like really, really difficult to happen due to various laws and horrible things that make it very difficult to organize. But most of the economy, or increasing amounts of the economy, are a different form of work.
Mm.
And that's true for younger people who are oftentimes the engine of these of these types of organizational efforts, and that's a real problem. So I think I didn't mean the end of mass politics piece to be blackpilling at all, but I think, like, as the science of historical materialism teaches us, you have to know what the fuck is going on.
Yeah.
Where does power actually lie? And that's the first step in the analysis, and then you go from there.
I've been really deep in Christopher Hill, English Civil War stuff, and it's one of the interesting things about that is if you were sort of a techno utopian, you could argue like the printing press and look at the word getting out to people and look at this sort of stuff. More and more people pamphleteering, and all of a sudden you get this revolutionary ferment. And yeah, like you say now we have sort of what would seem to be as good of a shot as a new version of the printing press and the internet. Your theory as to why it's not leading to that, basically because this time it's basically unveiled by the capitalists and controlled by capitalists entirely? Or what's your theory about like
Well, there's that
sort of angle?
sort of the Habermasian theory that liberal exchange of ideas is going in the marketplace of ideas is going to lead to some sort of transcendence. And I don't think that's true. I mean, going back to the printing press, people were arguing the same thing in the 1920s as print became cheaper. Were arguing
Hmm.
the same thing with television. People were arguing with the same thing with the internet. It's the same shit. Whenever there's a new, easier form of communication that allows you to reach numbers of people, the assumption is that there's going to be a function of that will be some sort of democratizing thing, and that's just empirically untrue. And so then the answer is like why, and there's a million answers related to history. You know, the organization of a society, who controls capital. Ideology is really critical. Religion is really critical. What people believe in, and so false consciousness. That was essentially an idea developed to understand why didn't the working class do what Marx said that they were going to do. And so what becomes clear, I think, analytically, is that class position doesn't lead to any necessary politics,
Mm.
and there's mediating ideologies, which is why vulgar Marxism doesn't work in actual history, because history is more complex and there's a feeding back between the base and the superstructure. So, Matt, to answer your question, there's no one answer. You'd have to look at the moment and then say these are the 45 different things that prevent communist utopia, in my opinion.
I mean, yeah, I mean, again, I agree with you too that like this isn't about trying to blackpill people. It's sort of trying to understand like the stage and the historical moment that we're at. And I will just note to people that even though some of this stuff might feel disappointing because we're not achieving the things that we want to at the moment, the life that like as someone who became I'm a little bit younger, but like I became a socialist before this kind of media apparatus, or really DSA was a large organization before Bernie Sanders, and it felt like a kind of little personal secret, and then Occupy happened, and it seemed like there were these movements, and this movement of like, I don't know, awakening of people. And it was certainly very exciting. And I think we're in a much stronger position now than we were, say, 10 years ago, just in the sense of like people's awareness. And like, I feel like there has been a kind of unleashing of like hope and optimism on some level. But I think what a lot of people are learning the hard way, unfortunately, is that there are very, very winning in politics is not just about like sort of like flipping a switch in a lot of people's brains, or like having like the most perfectly constructed argument that's going to like, you know, unlock like all of these different little social groups. It's the actual very difficult work of one, organizing, but also creating structures that can outlast sort of swells of like public opinion, right? So we saw these mass social movements at Occupy. We saw these mass uprisings, you know, with Black Lives Matter and after the murder of George Floyd. But you have to ask yourself about what the kind of structural result of those things have been, right? And a big reason, I think, I would argue, one of the big problems that we have is that we love movements, but we don't like structure, right? Like we love like the idea of people in the street, but when it comes to being able to communicate with those people after the fact, or being able to have some kind of message discipline, I mean, it dissipates very quickly.
And I think a lot of the political energy, for good and understandable reasons, because we are disconnected, on the left is a form of identitarian politics, because everything is a form of identitarian politics, because that is the age we live in. And I am not free of that. You are not free of that. No one is free of that. But this is why you see people fighting about like what form of communist they are.
Yes.
That is so, to me, silly when there's no communist movement. I always say it's like being an Aryan Christian in the 9th century. It's like this thing doesn't exist. So Arian for people, if you want to look into it. But it's like it's a movement that doesn't really exist anymore. So what are you even talking about? And that's because we are all personal brands, like blah 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 blah. All the structures indicate this. And so whether you're a Marxist, Leninist, a Maoist, third worldist, or a communist, it's like, what do you believe in utopia? Who gives a shit? You know, it's just a form of identitarian posturing that is absolutely totally meaningless. And so people are angry, and so this is where it gets channeled.
I have a hot take on this too, that I get worried now that, and look, I studied philosophy at school. I'm super into all this kind of stuff, but I've been seeing a kind of psychoanalytic turn too on the left lately. Everyone's getting
Which
back
always
to
happens
Lacan.
when the left loses, by the way.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. Psychoanalysis was introduced into Marxism by the Frankfurt School because they're like, why the fuck did everyone fight each other in World War I? Literally, they say that. This is what Eric Fromm is talking about. I write about this in my book. If you want to look at the beginning of chapter 2 of my book, I go into like why did the Frankfurt School decide to? What did the Frankfurt School do? It brought in psychoanalysis and it brought in a critique of culture. Why? What just happened? World War I. What was supposed to happen? The workers were not supposed to murder each other on European battlefields. So this is a big explanation. The answer is turns out it's not just class. You have to introduce elements of the human mind and introduce elements of culture, right? And my problem with psychoanalysis is a problem of any sort of psychology, which is that it's universalizing. In some sense, it's ahistorical, but I do think it's somewhat useful in understanding what humans do in particular moments. But like the human mind is not a static object that what Freud said in 1895 or 1930, for that matter, will necessarily apply. Though I do think it provides a very useful vocabulary for what people actually do.
I mean, damn, it's certainly interesting, but like, Lacan himself was very much against like using his models as like a basis of politics, right? Like he's pretty explicit about that, and it was his followers later who were like really pushed it. But that's, I mean, I just wanted to note that because I see this as a kind of like this is what happens after some feeling of, I don't know, left populism or mass movement that we saw under Bernie Sanders is like, okay, now we need to retreat to like the individual, right? Which I think is the worst lesson to take from our recent losses. But before we, we could go for a while, but I want to make sure that we get to your points in the piece about the last 20 years. Matt, could you pull up the piece of foreign exchange. Sorry. I just want to read these bullet points because I think they're strong. I'd be curious if you had anything you want to add to them too. You got this up, Matt?
Yeah, it was 1 second. There it is.
Okay, so if you go down to the bullets, I'll read it for people who are listening. So what have the last 20 years demonstrated? The rich can get richer and the poor can get poorer without there being a serious reaction. People are as a whole unwilling to put their lives on the line for politics. Congress largely has abandoned its role in war making. The voice provided by social media is largely an illusion when it comes to affecting those who wield real power. While the mass media is more interested in circuses than in informing, there is not a clear link between popular protests and political reform. those who control the Democratic Party feel no compunction to listen to their supposed constituents. For the moment, at least, capitalism has won, and its victory is totalizing. Excuse me. You don't need that many people to control and run the U.S. empire effectively. Trump taught us that very clearly. Of course, I do not wish to imply that the above realities are internal. Humans, as Marx rightly said, make their own histories, even if, as he added, we don't make them as we please. We live in a grim era where morbid symptoms abound. Our goal for the next decade must be to change that. And the only way to do so is to identify the present constellation of power in our society and strategize accordingly. If we do not, we will continue to suffer.
Yeah. Sounds like a genius wrote that.
I mean, I think in particular, like one of the most important bits, I think, in that list is when you note that there's not a clear link between popular protests and political reform. And I think that is one of the bigger illusions that I think a lot of like younger leftists get, and I just mean people who have only been thinking themselves as socialists or leftists or communists, for a few years, fall into, but also older folks do too. Because as I was saying before, like when I saw these mass movements of like Occupy and things like that, I was like, oh my Lord, like it's finally happening, and I get to live in history. And I was sort of blinded by the fact that just seeing people in the streets, just seeing people like giving a shit, really gave like, it blinded me to like the very serious structural problems with that movement, right? And it's something that Leo Panitch also notes too. It's one of my favorite lines of his, that he found one of the most encouraging things about the Sanders movement and the Corbyn movement was the move from what he called protest to politics.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like not the problem. I mean, I really like Panitch, right? I really like Chomsky. I really like all these guys, right? But they were just came of age in a totally different world, where seeing things like mass organization were possible. And I actually,
do you think mass organization is not possible? I might, I'd be curious.
Anything's possible, David.
Well, thank you very much.
Likely.
Yeah.
I think that, I think it's very difficult. And I think that we've been talking about it, at least it's active since the recession and since Occupy. It's been over a decade. I think there have been a few gains. I think if we take a hard look at the how far we've gone forward, we've done very well on the podcasts, extremely well, very poorly in every other area.
Well, I mean, I'm curious as to what you think about this. I think one of the larger challenges is not just, we're always talking about reaching out to folks, right? I think like a big hurdle that we have is like the destruction of civil society, right? Like where do you go in public? Yeah.
And I think that one thing that I had in this piece, now that I remember that Derek deleted, because he didn't think it was directly relevant, is like, when do revolutions actually happen? When do they? A lot of times, not going to say 90%, but a lot of times it's because of things like you don't have access to food. You can't get like calories or shelter, so those are oftentimes when you'll see like spontaneous revolutions, or in the case of like the Velvet Revolutions of the late 1980s, it's when this incredibly sclerotic structure that was an outside imperial power was controlling you. It's absent like extreme depredation, which we might see via climate change, but I don't think we'll see here, frankly. I think Kim Stanley Robinson is right. I think we in the developed North are going to be mostly okay, at least for our lifetimes. Those sorts of changes don't really happen that often. You don't storm the Bastille. I suggest anyone who wants to read about the French Revolution, read what French peasants were eating. I think they were eating something called like black bread, which is bread which you had to soak in water for like 30 minutes to make it soft enough to chew, right? That's a big difference from being able to go to McDonald's and eat. So I also think like these changes, like we have these revolutionary moments, but like capitalism has been successful in certain things. That's providing cheap calories, cheap entertainment. What I actually think is going to happen, I think you're going to see increasing legalization of vices. I think you're going to start seeing the legalization of sex work. I think you're going to start seeing the legalization of cocaine, mushrooms, maybe even some form of opiates. We already have essentially addicted the American underclass to opiates anyway. So why not just make it the whole shebang? I think you're going to see things like that. And then these aren't even going to be conscious choices. The algorithm is just going to be producing antibodies to protect itself. But I don't think unfortunately, it has to protect itself against much. Oh, and someone said in the post, Florida and Louisiana are going underwater. Yeah, certain parts of the country will be affected. Like we'll see city death. Like Miami might die in the
Yeah.
city. I've encouraged people to look up the Louisiana map from like the map we have is from the New Deal. Like a quarter or even more of that state is now underwater compared to the maps. But yeah, on a whole, I think we'll be okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that is one thing, but I think even like on the level of communities and groups that are affected, like Matt Huber does make a really great point. Is like the kind of like social justice, like environmental movement. They use these terms like frontline communities, but the vast majority of people who live in these quote unquote frontline communities, when you do surveys, they don't consider themselves to be people who are going to be affected by climate change, right? So, for people who think climate change is going to be like a political catalyst in and of itself, I think unfortunately are mistaken. Like that it will have the capacity to, like, at least in the United States, to have like a bottom up movement. I think it can definitely play a role for some people, right? But it won't do it for you. And like this is, I think, the big historical point that Danny is making too. Is like things can get really, really bad. And we can have the correct like social theory about like the structures and who's oppressing who, but that hasn't just been in and of itself like the engine or the fuel of revolt or revolution.
Yeah, people have to feel like it's worth putting their life on the line.
Mhm.
That's hard. That's really hard to do. And like it's people like the way I would frame it, like if people were storming the Capitol and then 4 people were shot, instead of retreating, they'd continue. That's a revolutionary moment, and they keep on going because they're willing to die for a cause. I think that is I don't see that happening anytime on the American left anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we have to build the capacity. I mean, I think Ronan Burtonshaw over at Tribune has a good line. If anything, it's a challenge, right? It's like the job of the socialist left is to convince working class people that politics can change their lives. And I'll tell you right now that that's not a very common belief amongst working people. If anything, politics is a bad thing, because every time that politics enters in their life, there's a bad outcome for them. Things get worse, right? Whenever the state starts getting interested in your life, it's not necessarily been a positive experience for most people. Well, you want to give anybody some like roses and sunshine before you leave, or
well, I mean, like it's an
should we
opportunity.
take a shot?
It's somewhat exciting, right? Like I think that the answers of the past clearly don't work. That's what anything has proven. So it's actually a time to think interestingly about things. I think there's a reason that a lot of our elders on the left are extremely elderly, because there wasn't a left for a long time. It's 70 plus. So hopefully we'll get some new people who more organically connected to what is going on in our society, and then what it means to live in front of a screen in a real way, which is what it is to be someone under 40. It's to live with a screen. And so that's a new sociality, and new opportunities, as every change results in new opportunities and new drawbacks.
Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, there's so many different places we can be sending folks to check out your work. I definitely suggest people read the whole piece, "The End of Mass Politics in Foreign Exchanges." Definitely check out American Prestige. I've been telling Danny it's been my podcast I listen to when I'm at the gym. So,
oh yeah,
you're contributing positively to this bot over here.
Yeah, I'm gonna start pumping you up. I'm gonna do like, do you remember who was it? It was Kevin Nealon who did like the subliminal message. It's like, yeah, so things are going on in Ukraine. Pump it up, David. Yeah, things
that you can check out Hinge Points, Jacobin. I mean, is there anything else that we should be directing people to, Danny? I mean,
no, that's too much already.
You're a busy man.
That's too much. Just check it out.
Well, I really appreciate you hanging out with us.
Thanks,
and
guys.
I'd love to do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Talk to you later. All right. Well, that was fun. I see patiently waiting. We have Gene. Do we need to get to anything before Gene? We're bringing you on just 1 second, but I want to take a quick moment to do a pitch for folks. Next week we're hitting Left Reckoning 50, which is a huge milestone for Matt and I. This project has been a really, really incredible and beautiful journey. I feel like we've been able to do a lot of the things that we set out to do, but there's a hell of a lot on the horizon. we're really wanting to take some more deep dives into left-wing history. We're going to do a segment about that later in the show. We're wanting to expand the amount of people we've been bringing on the show. Hopefully, once we're able to hit certain levels, start doing more on-the-ground reporting. But we can't do that without all the people who support the show. The best way to do this is at patreon.com/leftreckoning. You get the main show, you get the post game where we're going to be taking people's voicemails this week. And you also get the bonus episodes. This weekend, Matt and I are going to be taking a quick trip to Cryptoland, which I'm very much looking forward to.
It's the new Disneyland. Hey, just like Disneyland, a lot of people doubted it at the beginning, and then it blew up to be this thing that just controlled everything. It's the same thing with Cryptoland, and we're going there.
Super, super dark stuff, but we'll make it fun. And again, for people who are watching on Rockfin, you'll get access if you're a subscriber, premium subscriber, to the content and the bonus episodes that we put up on the Patreon as well. So we appreciate the support wherever we can get it, and really looking forward to hitting 50, 75, and 100 with all of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been I'm very proud of how we've kept this up. Is the TMBS stuff? It was great. I'm having a bit of a moment because we just had Danny on. I was listening to Djene talk to Michael on one of the first times, if not the first. He was on TMBS, and so we appreciate your support, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. No, and I'm happy that we'll be able to hear people's voices this week too. That was always something we loved at TMBS. But before Matt and I get too sappy, let's bring on our good friend and comrade, Djene Bajalan.
Yeah, Djene Bajalan. He's a historian of Mideast history at Missouri State University. He is, as I said, a TMBS OG and This Is Revolution regular. He's also an unsung literary hangover research assistant. Djene Bajalan, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you guys. It's a real honor, and it was quite a blast from the past having Black Pill Bessner on.
Black Pill Bessner, I love it.
I'm really glad to be here. I hope you guys are doing well, and greetings from all the This Is Revolution crew to you all. We hope to have you guys over soon, and I see you have Restream, so I'm impressed.
For now, who knows?
We were trying to be little hipsters and do something different, but it's feeling like this might be the best way to go.
Yeah, and just to do a quick double plug, Djene is actually guesting on the American Prestige podcast, doing a history of the Kurds. Is that right, Djene?
Yeah, so Danny invited me on with Danny and Derek invited me on to talk about the Kurds. We actually planned to talk about the lead up to the First World War, but we ended up doing from about the 11th century to 1750. So we've had to do another record where we managed to get to about 1890. So hopefully we'll get to the First World War at some point. But it's been really fun working with those guys. The stuff Daniel is doing is really fantastic. He's building an impressive American prestige industrial complex empire. So I'm and they do so much work. I don't know how he has time in the day, but he definitely should keep it up.
Yeah. No, I mean, he's putting out a pretty impressive amount of work, but so are you. I mean, I'm really excited to have you on to sort of help break down some of the recent events in Turkey. I know Matt had some questions to sort of get you started on that, but I feel like it's a part of the world that is really crucial for people to understand, one, because of its role globally, but also because it really is the site of a lot of interesting kind of left-wing and right-wing movements at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Turkey is pretty pivotal in not only Middle Eastern history, but in world history, in the sense that, for example, these huge refugee flows heading towards Europe, which have shaken up the European political order in quite a profound way. Those are mediated through Turkey. Turkey is a big player in Syria. Turkey has been a big player in Libya. And of course, Turkey was heavily involved in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. So, Turkey is obviously not is not China or India, but certainly it is an extremely influential country that occupies an important strategic position in the world, simply because of its because of its geographical organization. So, what happens in Turkey has profound ripple effects, both westwards into Europe, but also down across the Middle East, Central Asia, and places like that. So it's important to consider. And given the ongoing economic crisis, the global capitalist system is a house of cards. So you never know what kind of shock is going to send the whole thing into collapse. So it's perfectly possible that, continued economic crisis in Turkey could be some kind of trigger to a broader global crisis.
Yeah, so we had you on 4 or 5 years ago now at this point to talk about the
was it that long
FaceTime.
ago? Was it that
I
long
think
ago?
so. Was it 20? Maybe 3. I think
What,
it
the
might have been 4.
FaceTime coup?
The FaceTime coup.
FaceTime.
That was 2018, wasn't it?
Was it 2018? Okay,
I could be wrong. I'm just shooting that out the top of my head. So don't.
2017, 2018, who knows?
Yeah. Anyway.
But so and now we have Erdogan in. You mentioned the economic troubles. Give us a little overview of Erdogan. He's in the news a lot as a sort of authoritarian, anti-democratic. What's like the I guess the understanding of that FaceTime coup now, and what has he done since? And I have this clip we can play later of what I'm just gonna put it up now. This is from when this is October 7th, 2019. Erdogan, actually this might be a later clip. I should have got these dates right, but anyway, this is Erdogan in DC, and it's a compilation of a bunch of clips on ordering like his security to go start a massive brawl. He's in the car there. And then the order goes out. Affirms it. They start attacking these Kurdish protesters, pro-Kurd protesters. So yeah, I mean, I just give that to like set the table a little bit. Give us your characterization of Erdogan.
So Erdogan is a political opportunist in a general sense, and has gone through different phases. He comes out of the political Islam tradition in Turkey, and that has a deep tradition on the political right. But generally, before Erdogan came to power, that faction of the right, the Islamist right, and there are various gradations of that, were generally kind of marginalized within the Turkish political order by the dominance of secular nationalist elites, the Kemalists, as they're called, and the military, which was extremely suspicious of Islamist governments. In 1997, for example, the Rafa Party, which came to power, was ousted by a kind of soft coup, and Erdogan came out of that milieu and basically established this new party, AKP, which brought together sort of some veteran politicians, but really presented itself as a kind of new, more moderate face of political Islam. They drew comparisons with Christian Democrats in Europe, and they came to power in 2002. They didn't have a huge popular vote, but due to the vagaries of the Turkish electoral system, they gained a massive majority in the parliament. In fact, even as their vote share went up over subsequent years, they lost seats because of the nature of the Turkish political system. So they came into power with this kind of strong position, and their core of support basically lay in the provincial petty bourgeoisie, certain provincial elements of capital that had both politically and culturally felt excluded from the governing order in Turkey. So the governing order in Turkey had been dominated by these secular coastal elites that ran the show.
Starting to sound a little bit Trumpy.
Yeah, and in fact, this was the first article Michael and I wrote together, was the American AKP, which drew those parallels. So, and I actually think Turkey and America do have some, at least echoes, in terms of the way their politics, is like dominated by right-wing forces that fight a sort of culture war rather than like a left-right, more traditional left-right division. But basically, Erdogan comes to power with this core of provincial petty bourgeoisie. Many of them had gotten rich with the neoliberal economic transformations of the 1980s. You had this like new industrial sector growing in the provinces, and AKP brought this core together with other groups that were alienated by the existing political order, including the military and the Kemalist elites, many of whom were, state bureaucrats and big capitalists in the major cities. And so there were, urban poor, many of whom had, in recent times head to the city. But the coalition also brought in an important element of Kurdish society that was alienated by the long history of violence. AKP came in offering a kind of softer approach to the Kurdish question. And liberals who saw the primary threat to Turkish democratization as the far right, the military, and those groups. So you have this sort of liberal phase of the AKP, which also benefited from a kind of, there was an economic crisis in Turkey in the early 2000s. There was like an IMF plan, and we see this imposition of neoliberalism, like neoliberal policies, but they're not pure neoliberal policies in the sense that they have this kind of Clintonian directed welfare, which of course benefits many of the poorest in society who had previously not had sort of any opportunity to get any state benefit or any support from the state, and that helped consolidate support. So we have this like liberal phase in the early AKP years, and very much that early phase was characterized, and I think this was a mistake that many liberals and even leftists made at the time, was characterized by the AKP's sort of fight against the entrenched state elites, the derin devleti, the deep state, which is a term that has been used. I mean, I heard the term deep state used in Turkey extensively long before it became popular in America, but you had this deep state where you have military far right forces. There was this famous car accident, Susuluk, where they had where a far right MP and like kind of gang leaders were all organized crime, were all in the same car together, kind of exposed this infrastructure. So the AKP faced resistance from secular elites. There were big protests, for example, over the presidency when Erdogan's ally Abdullah Gül became president. There was opposition to that. And then, of course, things escalated with the beginning of trials and prosecutions against some of the old guard, old elite, these nationalists, military people of far right forces. This Ergenekon trial, which was facilitated with the support of the Gülen movement, the Fethullah Gülen movement, which is its own particular Islamic tradition, but was supportive, at least in the early phases of the AKP. So there's this early phase. We have a kind of liberalizing political order. There is, amongst some elements of society, some kind of optimism as well. We see the beginnings of a peace process with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the hopes that question might be put to bed. And sort of that liberal phase carries on for a bit, but of course, over time, there's a kind of there's growing opposition as economic growth isn't evenly distributed. The government becomes more corrupt. There are corruption charges and corruption accusations against Erdogan and his family, and we gradually see the AKP move away from this liberal phase where we have Erdogan playing the role of being a Muslim modernizer. And in fact, in the aftermath of 9/11, the Turkish model was this like alternative to, Wahhabist or like Al-Qaeda type Islam. So there was also like a lot of good press there. There's a shift away from this to Erdogan becoming more and more authoritarian. And, in the 2010s, there are several events that kind of cement this trajectory. I would say, the Gezi protests, followed by the AKP's maneuvering following the fact in 2015 they lost their parliamentary majority. So Erdogan kind of did a bunch of political maneuvering, held another election to get back the majority. So basically refused to kind of accept the results. And then finally in 2016, we have in the summer of 2016, basically an attempted coup d'etat. Who exactly is responsible for that coup d'etat? It's like, I would not want to make any definitive statements on that, given the fact that the evidence we get out of Turkey is highly politicized. And, the judicial process is certainly problematic. So we have this coup d'etat, but, there were elements, including perhaps Gülenist supporting elements, whether with his connivance or whether autonomously, old Kemalists seeing the writing on the wall, because of course, the old elite was gradually being changed out the longer the AKP is in power. Even within the military, you're having a shift in the cadre who are going up the ranks. So the power of the Kemalists is declining, ever seeping away slowly. So perhaps this was the last chance saloon for them. You have this coup, and then following this coup d'etat, you have like basically a big intensification of repression, a purging of state institutions, blacklisting of people, change in the constitution to under conditions of emergency martial law, to create a strong executive presidency, and then growing imperial adventures overseas, including in Syria and Libya and Azerbaijan, and a shift away from this initial kind of bloc which was built with the support of liberals, to basically bringing back the hard right nationalists, or at least factions of the hard right nationalists, some of whom had been prosecuted in the earlier phase of AKP rule, bringing those guys back and building a new kind of political coalition which basically excludes the Kurds and relied increasingly on the hard right, personified by Devlet Bahçeli and the National Action Party, the kind of fascistic grey wolves wing. So Erdogan basically does a kind of volte-face in his political orientation. So we see him playing the kind of liberal modernizer in the first part, and then with the collapse of that, so he plays the Obama and the Trump, if you want to use it in America, Rose. He plays both those roles in Turkey, but of course, he does it, far more. He does his Trump turn far more effectively, because he's a relatively, the system in Turkey is more centralized and relatively easier for him to dominate. So I hope that sums it up.
No, I mean, it certainly does. And I mean, I hate to ask you another kind of broad question in addition to that, but just to help people who might not be, to understand the kind of internal dynamics in Turkey. What is it like, both sort of politically and, I don't know, like your day-to-day experience potentially for like the average kind of working class, particularly like younger Turkish person? I mean, what is the state for the vast majority of people who work for a living in the country of Turkey right now?
Well, now it's pretty dire. Like, you're having huge inflation problems, major mismanagement, and there's all kinds of like tragic stories coming out of Turkey with young people feeling hopeless about the future, about their job prospects. There was recently a young boy killed himself, because of these like increasingly difficult social conditions. And young people are like increasingly angry at a system which is both increasingly nepotistic, and in which their prospects for the future look more and more dire, because the economic fortunes of the country seem to be in a kind of terminal decline, and at the same time you have this political elite that is clearly enjoying, they're clearly making money in this situation. They're the ones who know about the interest rates, so they can do the currency speculation. They're
Much
the
like
ones with
Pelosi here, you know.
right. They're the ones who have the good context to get jobs. But if you don't have the context, you're excluded. So it's
But
a dire situation for many.
but at the same time, I'm just asking, is there among, especially like younger people who are looking, for ways out, a kind of, you know, wherever you see systems like that, there are always people who say, okay, well, if the power's in the state, if it's centralized, I need to find a way to get into the room, right? I mean, is there any kind of movement of youth in support of Erdogan that you would sort of note as sizable or notable, or is it, more across the board, sort of disgust and disappointment in general?
That's a good question. Like, I wouldn't want to make any super strong statements
Yeah. Of course, and I'm not trying to put you in that spot. Yeah.
because I haven't been to Turkey in a couple of years, so like I wouldn't say I have like an ear on the ground of like what scuttlebutt is and what
Mhm.
you're hearing, but from like Turkish social media, from from like other like academic sources and things like that, or people who I talk to who are from Turkey. The sort of thing is there. I think there's a kind of hopelessness. The AKP, for example, has they have a youth wing. They try to do these like social media campaigns and things like that, but they fall flat. The Gen Z seem pretty cynical about the prospects of the future. Um, there's still very strong Turkish nationalism amongst Turkish elements of society, but like that doesn't sort of rally necessarily behind Erdogan. And in fact, one of the things about the opposition, the opposition also includes hard right elements,
Mhm.
such as the E Party, which was a split from the National Action Party. So the National Action Party, the MHP, which is this fascist party that Erdogan relies for support. That party split, and the kind of anti-AKP faction is in the opposition. There are some of this opposition is taking a kind of hard right sort of stance. Amongst Kurdish youth, for example, there was an enormous amount of social protest in 2014, 2015 as well, hugely radicalized youth. I mean, again, there was these huge battles which destroyed, many of the Kurdish majority cities. And, the PKK is, blamed for that. But my tendency is to think that the PKK they were following the lead of the radicalized youth and sort of backing their revolt so as to not lose control over the radicalized youth as well. So you basically have a situation where, you have an opposition which to a certain degree at the moment is coalescing because of the economic crisis, but they're like very deep fissures in it. And one of the fundamental contradictions of the opposition is that it hasn't managed to resolve, the Kurdish question in a sense that the HDP, which was the Kurdish pro-Kurdish party, but in about 2014, 2015, began to present itself less as a Kurdish party and more of a kind of Syriza, Corbyn, Labour, general front for the left. That wing of the left has been suppressed. So what are you left with in the opposition? You have a kind of milquetoast, kind of, let's say, reformed Kemalists, like in the CHP, the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which is the main, inverted commas, Kemalist opposition, which has kind of tried to moderate itself. It has a popular mayor in Istanbul, a popular mayor in Ankara. They won these local elections, but it's kind of it's a milquetoast, neoliberal kind of social democratic posing party. Then you have a hard right fascistic Turkish nationalist party, but that is anti-AKP. And then you have like these former AKP ministers, including former Prime Minister Davutoğlu, with their small kind of liberal Islamist political parties, creating like this opposition. So even if by hook or by crook this opposition could win power, They're like very divided in many ways, and they don't really have a program that could address some of the like fundamental economic and political problems facing Turkey. And the radical left, which had coalesced around the HDPs, which the core were Kurdish voters, but it attracted just general sort of left-orientated people across the country, and that movement has been suppressed through all kinds of legal mechanisms, election results. Elected officials have been purged and replaced by appointed officials in local governments. MPs have been arrested. The leaders have been arrested. So the movement, that's a kind of constitutional leftist movement, has been eliminated to a large degree from the field, although it's still contesting elections. And then you have this opposition. But my general feeling is that, they won't abolish elections in Turkey, but I'm sure Erdogan will find some kind of way to stay in power. Erdogan did a Putin. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's a silver lining that he doesn't have there's not a turning points APK to kind of rouse up the youngsters there.
They do have like huge social media troll armies that like harass people, and there are always these kind of campaigns against people. And there's like all kinds of things. Like, for example, there was a Turkish fashion designer who criticized the AKP on Twitter, and mysteriously a group of 12 men broke onto the runway at Ataturk airport and beat him up while he was getting onto a plane. Wonder how that happened. So there's this kind of like increasing gangsterism and mob rule taking place.
I mean, and you see it, even coming here, which is a huge thing. To see people in DC getting beat up. I mean, that was something else. Not that DC is some kind of holy city, but that kind of violence very rarely reveals itself in the US. Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings us to one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was this Enes Freedom, Enes Kanter situation. And we covered Enes on TMBS because he got on the wrong end of Erdogan. He since taking a bit of a turn, get meetings with a lot of like State Department people, that sort of thing. And I wanted to get your opinion on that, because I must say I feel a little bit bad for how hard I've went at Enes, because I look back at it and he's like a 30-year-old something basketball player who's been through stuff, and like I don't know if he's just a dumb guy like caught up in stuff and being used for like his propaganda value, but give us the context for Enes Kanter and Gulen, Fethullah Gulen, and Gulanism, and what your take on like Kanter is, but also give us people the Gulen context.
Yeah, so Gulen is this religious leader in Turkey. He has his own brand. Well, he's not in Turkey. He's in Pennsylvania now, and he's been in exile since the late 1990s. And he comes out of this comes out of the Nurcu movement, which was led by Said Kurdi, who was a like Islamic reformer in the early 20th century, who became a kind of big critique of like a big anti-materialist, if that makes sense. He was like, we got to have like an anti-materialist view of the world, and focus not so much on seizing power directly, but working through in society through informal networks. And Fethullah Gulen comes out of that school, and he developed this movement. They call they say Gulen movement, but like the Gulenists call it Hizmet, which is a service movement. And they had clubs and all kinds of like businesses, schools, a lot of civil society type organizations. They also had enormous missionary work around the world. They established schools in Africa and in across the Middle East, Central Asia, Philippines. They're even involved in charter schools in the United States. So the Gulen movement has its fingers in a lot of pies, but it's not like a central organization in which you have like a clear command and control. There's no like executive board. Gulen is like this kind of reclusive religious figure who's sitting in Pennsylvania in a compound, and then you have all these like different sort of forms of activity which are funded by contributions and business people. And this group was like very very successful. It was in alliance with Erdogan's movement, which comes out of a different branch of Islamism. It infiltrated state institutions. There were all these cases where Gulenists in the police force were assisting students in taking their examinations and that kind of stuff. So they did this kind of state infiltration, and many of the kind of leaked documents against the Kemalists during the early phases of AKP rule were leaked by Gulenists working inside the state. So they had this kind of infiltration operation taking place, and then they tried to turn that on Erdogan. They were involved in highlighting a corruption scandal where he's like on the phone talking about moving the money, and they did not. They thought they were the player, but they got played, because you can have a big civil society organization, but you know what's better than that? State power, and and they got the hammer on them, right? And then when this coup, and the hammer had been going down for a while, and the hammer went down hard, it went down hard. And then after the coup, it went down super hard. And, you like have tons of people who are just caught up in this, It's like a big movement. And not everybody was at the same level of like involvement. These were people who were just sort of pious Muslims or engaging in what they saw, like doing education and things like that. But basically, association with any kind of Gulenist institution has become a raison d'etre to be purged from your job, to be blacklisted, to be forced out of the country. Some people have like, and like maybe some of these charges are true. Maybe some of these people did conspire to do sort of illegal activities, but the sheer kind of just general sweep, which include like primary school teachers,
Right.
these kind of things. These it's just like really big. So like Fethullah Gulen went from being like a friend of the regime. There are pictures with Erdogan and Gulen together, to being public enemy number one, where if you're critical of the government, one of the accusations they'll throw at you is that you're a FETÖ Jew, you're a follower of Fethullah Gulen, and it's basically the kind of like internal enemy. So you have like Fethullah Gulen playing this role as a boogeyman, and basically Enes Kanter has kind of been caught up in that, right? And like I don't have. Like, I feel sorry for the average Fethullah Gulen follower, but, the movement itself was not like this goody two-shoes movement that they try and present themselves like. They had these kind of dodgy political ambitions. They did forged documents. They did kind of, knocking on people to the state and things like that. They played the game, and then they got played. For it. Yeah, they were going for it too. So, but they got beat because state power wins out in the end. And this huge purge took place, and the coup just accelerated that purge to epic proportions and provided an excuse for the Turkish state to further kind of not get rid of democracy, but clamp down on sort of the ability, clamp down, basically destroy people's livelihoods so they can't function in the system.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the outlook for like Erdogan, and how much can he stay in the Trump mode for a while, or does he have to shift to after being both? Go ahead, David.
No, and I was saying, and as an addition to that, I mean, I know that there is some kind of grandstanding that you get from American politicians about him. But do you think that there is any kind of real desire, for example, within the Biden administration or powers that be, to sort of see him go away, or see a known enemy?
So, like, in terms of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, like, people are certainly not that sweet on Erdogan. There are fears, at least I've heard sort of foreign policy analysis people fearing about what a post Erdogan Turkey might look like, because one of the strengths Turkey historically had is that even though it was an authoritarian state, they had relatively strong institutions like the military and the judiciary and things like that. But Erdogan has like kind of hollowed out a lot of that stuff and increasingly turned Turkey into a one-party, one-man rule state where things revolve around his personality. So I've heard some foreign policy people worry about, Erdogan's bad, but like if he collapses and Turkey ends up in a kind of even a low-intensity civil war, you're going to have like millions of people just like taking advantage of that and scooting to Europe. In terms of and actually there are also right-wing, particularly right-wing think tanks and right-wing foreign policy people who are like very much in favor of supporting Erdogan. Erdogan throws, his people throw a bit of money around DC. You can buy yourself a right-wing person, such as, for example, General Flynn, who was paid for, wrote a op-ed in The Hill, saying that we needed to support Turkey in its war against terrorism, against Fethullah Gulen. So you have some right-wing factions. Trump, his evangelical base doesn't like Erdogan for a whole variety of different reasons. But like a lot of the people around him, and including Trump, if you read his, if you read some of the accounts of his opinions, he was like pretty impressed with Erdogan for being Erdogan has big rallies. He knows how to do that kind of stuff. He was, Erdogan knew how to play Trump. Like he knew how to play him.
Oh yeah.
The Biden administration, I think there is like kind of bad blood there, but and they would probably like to see Erdogan go, but Turkey is, it's a major partner. The Europeans might not like Turkey, but the Germans still were selling weapons to them. The EU still pays them off to stop the Syrians coming.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's a physical barrier for them too.
So he's got a pretty strong international position. He's like playing off the United States and Russia against each other. Sometimes he's aligning more with the United States. Sometimes he's aligning with Russia. But he's playing. He's using this kind of strategic autonomy that Turkey possesses because of its geopolitical location to extract concessions from major powers and avoid the punishments that a country like Iran would be substitute if they did the same kind of thing. Can you imagine if the Iranians, the eggs people would lay if the Iranians were sending troops to Libya and Azerbaijan? So you have this, and there are some like serious bones of contention. There's this legal case, the Halkbank case, which is like something Erdogan really wants to go away, to do with all kind of sanction busting stuff with Iran. But Erdogan's playing this game, and he's using the fact that he plays this game to kind of present himself as an anti-imperialist. One of the weirdest parts of his new coalition is that he has like this guy called Dol Perenchik on his side, who's a former Maoist, and who's now like he has like this weird a Maoist ultra secularist who is now presenting a kind of he's kind of like he's kind of like a Nazbol, if that makes sense to people. He's kind of like one of these Eurasianists who's like, he's like big into China, and he's like, Turkey needs to be in this Eurasian bloc. So you have these like kind of weird constellations coming into being. I follow that newspaper, the newspaper Aydınlık, which is the newspaper of this like former Maoist organization. And it's like the headlines are like, it's like a weird combination. It's like a weird anti-imperialist language, but in service of Erdogan and the Erdogan regime, which of course is just a fucking tin pot capitalist regime. And Erdogan is like, he shifted a little bit away from the old kind of World Bank economic policy to like a little bit more state capitalist kind of nonsense. But it's a big old, it's like there's a kind of malaise in Turkey, but Erdogan still has, control. Maybe he'll get second eye. Maybe something will have that. I am like, there's a lot of talk these days about Erdogan in his twilight right now. And while the regime does seem to be like increasingly unpopular and brittle, I'm not sure that the opposition can necessarily coalesce. And B, I am pretty skeptical, and I could be persuaded that like you're going to have a normal kind of election situation where, because you don't have to rig an entire election, you just need to do like selective kind of gerrymandering. And because of the nature of the Turkish system, they might be able to pull it out of the bag. So I'm like very concerned that we go to an election, and then if it looks like AKP has lost and things like that, there could be serious trouble. Although like opinion polls seem to show that there are some potential presidential candidates who could definitely beat Erdogan. But the problem is, are they going to play? Is Erdogan going to like play the game where he like just fuels divisions within the opposition so they cannibalize each other because they're like pretty incoherent as well? So like I'm very like concerned about the future. Like lots of people are kind of suffering in Turkey now. The kind of securitization and violence of the state is becoming, it happens. I like, the way I think of it is like, look, all these kind of like police measures and this kind of political gerrymandering and legal kind of lawfare removal of democratically elected people, they all pioneered that shit in the Kurdish regions against the HDP, against the radical left. Now, more and more, it's looking like they're going to deploy that kind of stuff amongst in the kind of like Turkish areas, which had hitherto not been subject to that kind of thing. In Turkey, and this is a kind of like historical thing, the road to autocracy leads through Kurdistan. Starts there and then heads to and those kind of things head to the capital. When the republic was founded, the big Kurdish uprising, which was suppressed by the Kemalists, was the excuse to have a general purge of Turkish politics and these independent tribunals. So this is a pattern that repeats. What they do to the Kurds will be done to other elements of the opposition when the time comes.
Well, Gene, I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I feel like that was very helpful. There's definitely a lot more that we could be getting into, but were you still planning on hanging out with us for a little bit in the post game, or?
Sure, more than happy
All
to.
right.
It's great to talk with you guys.
Well, great. Well, we have one more segment before we go there, but we'll let Gene go so we can take a quick break. I'll text you. Probably get on around 9 our time.
Okay.
And Gene will be in there for the post game, and again, a little plug. We'll be taking voicemails, so get those in as well. Check out.
Yeah,
Gene's
they're actually there's one already in there. So if
there's some already waiting for us there, so get those in. We put the number up on the Patreon for people to be able to call in, but definitely check out Gene's. Go ahead.
Can I plug something? Yeah,
absolutely.
So,
that's what I was getting into.
So I just want to say, people should check out This Is Revolution, of course, but also I would like to say Jason has done. We're getting into the video essay game, and Jason Miles has written a video essay on the decline of punk and neoliberal politics in the 90s. So he's done a video essay on that. We have a couple of other. So we have a 2-part series on Lenin and a couple other things in the go. So check those out if you have the time. And please, if you're not a subscriber to This Is Revolution, please do it. We're trying to get to 10,000, by March. Hit that number.
Where that now?
We're at I guess we're at I don't know, 7,000.
Oh, yeah,
it went fast, and then it's been pulling teeth, and Pascal keeps checking every day. So if you don't want Pascal's heart to sink, Give us
Do
the
it for our
source code.
man.
Do it for Pascal. So I'll see you guys in about 20 minutes.
Yeah, so
Cool.
if y'all want to see Gene join us on the other side of patreon.com/left reckoning, people in Rockfin will be able to have access to that too. See you soon, Gene. Thanks
Thanks,
again.
Gene.
All right, y'all. We've done the pitch. We've gone through a lot of things. This is a little treat for me. This is a new segment. I haven't come up with a sexy name for it yet. Maybe y'all can come up with something in the chat as we're going. I don't know. Preliminary ideas or something like take hold of our history. The idea is that I wanted to take some time, occasionally to look back at kind of radical moments in American history to remind us that, we aren't just sort of trying to create a whole left-wing history and movement out of nothing. There actually is a very strong and proud tradition in this country of people who've been fighting against the systems of capitalism, racism, slavery, etc. And we should uphold and see ourselves as continuations of that fight rather than something new, sort of, stepping into the arena for the first time.
Reinvent the wheel, I think, is the phrase that they use.
Yeah, I think that's probably cleaner than mine. The first story that I want to tell was one. It's close to home, of course. It's a story about Texas, but I find it to be quite radical. And I've known about it for a little while, but I want to come back to it just because I've been doing a lot of historical investigation just out of my own interest into Texas from like 1850 to like the early 1900s. And one thing that is really interesting is there's a lot of people who spend time covering this period of time in Texas. There's a lot of great blogs and podcasts and things like that. The vast majority of them I would categorize as right wing to center right. And what's interesting about it is that the way that they tell the story of Texas and a lot of the people who came here in that period of time really overshadows the kind of radical nature and proletarian dream, working class dream that a lot of people had when they came here. And I think this story is certainly one of them. So the story I wanted to talk to you all about is something called the Fence Cutting Wars. And just to set the stage a little bit, Texas, had people who came here obviously before the Texas Revolution. Obviously, there's people here, during the Civil War, etc. But you start to see this mass migration of poor farmers, along with sort of freed slaves, into the state of Texas towards the end of the 19th century. Right. And a lot of these poor farmers were people coming from the South, but you also saw a decent amount of people coming, south from the Midwest as well. And they came here because there was a lot of land that they could claim. And, the vast majority of the land, as is typical, ends up getting controlled by a few large families, sort of wealthy capitalists. But you start to see this increase of kind of small plot farming, people who were raising cattle because the land here wasn't super suited for growing. Obviously, there's some parts of East Texas where that's the case. But for a lot of people, having animals that could roam these massive open plains, it was very, very viable. So you start to see a lot of people moving here to do that. And you see a few things start to happen. One is the introduction of barbed wire. Barbed wire was invented in 1874. And it completely changed the West. And not only was it a kind of brutal symbol of the changes that were coming to this part of the world, it was truly a weapon in the mass enclosure of public space. And people who were using barbed wire were essentially doing that to prevent any kind of cattle or even just movement of people from going across land. Oftentimes this was used on land that people, technically own, but more often than not, it was used to cover up public roads, access to water, things that were supposed to be owned communally by the public, right? And it also was a huge affront, to kind of conceptions like right to roam, or the to the open roaming of cattle, right? The idea that you should be able to move across these vast open spaces that sort of typify the West at that period of time, that you start to see that this start to rapidly change. On top of all of this, right, you see one of these crises that happens across the United States before we changed our currency system, of a mass depression, which meant that a lot of these people who first came here and they opened up and were able to stake out for themselves very, very small farms, you saw them lose the farms that they worked on, having those farms then be bought out by major banks, and then those people becoming tenant farmers on the land that they had once owned, right? Which is a quite quite a humiliating experience, right? And Texas really has this history that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with of pretty extreme tenant farming, particularly tenant farming with kind of poor whites, where a lot of times across the rest of the South, it was former slaves, freed slaves who were working those lands. In Texas, you certainly see that as well, but you also see this kind of poor white class very much involved in that system, right? So, anyways, you're seeing this mass movement of you're seeing people who have moved here getting dispossessed off their land from capital, and then you're also seeing these massive tracts of land being bought up by northern capital and particularly British capital. This happened during the Reconstruction period. And then when the Democrats come back into power after the radical Republicans sort of gave up on the dream of Reconstruction, the Southern Democrats then starts opening up the land in Texas to other speculators, primarily people who wanted to build massive private railroads, right? So barbed wire only is not only a symbol of this fight, but it was the weapon that was used by these big capitalists who owned incredible amounts of land. People who the term for them at the time was cattle kings, cattle barons. They start using the kind of economic crisis to take more and more land, and then they just start putting up barbed wire wherever, without any kind of relationship to if they even own the land, if it was public land. They were just making a stake and a claim on the land. And this is why, and this is the part of the story that I want to focus on, and this is the kind of radical history that we have. Do you think that people back then, do you think that they sat around and they went to the courts and they sort of hoped that if they voted for a nice candidate, that maybe this would change? No. They went out and engaged in mass movements of, of property destruction. And this is this period of time is known as the fence cutting wars. So again, this happened across the West, especially in New Mexico at this time, but it's very notable in Texas because there's this very clear class dimension to it. You see the big landed owners start putting barbed wire on their property over public lands, over water. But this was clearly in violation of the principle of the commons. And this was the kind of phrasing that people were using at this time, that this is our public lands. This is our land that is now being cut off to us by these kind of rich capitalists. So what people start doing is they start getting together in large posses of boys and cutting down these barbed wire fences. And it immediately becomes a violent clash. So much so that the people who are cutting down the fences would arm themselves as they were engaging in this. And then obviously the big capitalists, the big landowners, were hiring armed guards and thugs to come and to attack these people. They understood very clearly, though, that what they were doing was not just, in their own immediate interest, in the sense of, like, certainly there's people who are cutting down those fences because they had a big, herd of cattle that they're trying to move across land and they see this obstruction. But what makes the movement in Texas really fascinating is you start to get these mass movements of vigilantes who would just go around with the sole purpose and with the sole mission of cutting down the devil's wire wherever they saw it. And they had these really awesome names, Matt. Things like the Owls, the Blue Devils, or my personal favorite, the Knights of the Nipper. And they went around and they cut down these barbed wire fences. Again, it's a very violent. 1883 really is when it blows up, and it is the Texas Rangers, right? The same forces that were used to expel the Comanches from their lands, who were then used to brutally put down these kind of vigilante groups that were cutting down the different barbed wires that they saw pop up around the land. And I just want to read just really quick so y'all understand that I'm not just putting my own spin on this today. The way that this was being reported by local papers in Texas. This is from a really phenomenal book. I don't know if y'all can see it. The Grassroots Socialism Radical Movements in the Southwest, 1895 to 1943. But this right here is from the Galveston News. The fence-cutting wars grew out of a dangerous policy of selling off the public domain and allowing the creation of principalities and baroniates among a few capitalists. Land monopolies and enclosures had aroused a spirit of agrarianism among the poor classes. The fence cutters were soon suppressed by armed guards who were bitterly labeled the mounted Cossacks of the cattle barons, and by the Texas Rangers who had killed Sam Bass, the generous, open-hearted highwayman, a kind of Robin Hood to the poor classes, right? The homesteaders lost a violent battle. This is from the book itself. The homesteaders lost a violent battle over the barbed wire fences, but they eventually won a place for themselves on the fertile Texas plains. And we're going to do a lot sort of breaking down this history, but it is an interesting moment because this is not the end of these radical movements. In a lot of ways, this is the beginning of people who started to recognize that not only do they have local domestic enemies, but they have class enemies. And it was the fact that it was all of these wealthy people, from locals, people who had come to Texas, when it was part of Mexico, who ended up owning these homesteads, but also Northern capital, British capital, who were coming in there and taking up this land and denying people the common right to use the land around them. So very, very radical moment. And I want to share a photograph right quick with y'all. This is not from Texas. This is some people doing this in Nebraska. Again, this was not just, unique to Texas.
Wyoming as well. I know the Johnson County War might be another one that we talk about in a similar context.
Very happy to do it. Let me get this up for y'all. So I don't know. Let me see if I can make this a little larger for people, because it is an interesting. So these are some guys in Nebraska, I believe, cutting down the fences, and they're wearing masks to protect their identity because, as we noted, people get are getting brutally put down. And the last thing I just wanted to note before ask you if you have any thoughts, Matt, is that again I came across this because I was just reading random things and I was like getting into like sort of reinvestigating the fence cutting wars, right? And this is something that people who study history, who are interested in history, follow here. But the way that it's always presented is oh, wow, this is a great moment for the Texas Rangers when they started to really, break down the kind of rabble and make Texas go from a wild state to a state of laws, right? And there's no doubt about it that the brutal force of the Rangers played a role in some way. But I'll tell you one thing right now. The vast majority of people who are very proud to say, I come from a family of 8 generations, 7 generations, 6 generations in Texas, you are far, far, far more likely to be related to one of those fence cutters, or the Knights of the Nipper, than you are to some kind of big, cattle baron, right? And I think this is why these kind of stories are really important because, history is very important for us to understand both our conditions and how we got here. But it's also important because our opponents try to mystify our history. And throughout our history, as capital is starting to dominate, as capitalism is starting to become the dominant form in this country, there was fierce resistance to it, and it understood itself as resistance to it. Right, people. The people who were really involved in this ended up becoming some of the earliest and founding members of the American Socialist Party. Right, this is not just some kind of accidental event. Right, this has a direct connection to all of the further movements of the American left. Right, this is part of the struggles that it was born out of, and I think that. I think that it's very, very important to be able to correct folks who are sitting here thinking that this history should be understood as some kind of great victory for the Texas Rangers, when in fact it was a brutal attack on the commons and on people and on working people.
I mean, how American is that, though, right? Like that brutal attack on the commons, and
for sure,
people at large gets turned into we'll do what we can here to try to reprogram the kids with our critical enclosure of the commons theory.
Hell yeah, yo. Well, I appreciate everybody for hanging out with us. We got a lot more to get to in the post game. Djene Bajalan's going to be joining us, and we're going to be taking some voicemails from y'all. So you can get access to that phone number and to the post game by subscribing at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Also, people who are premium subscribers on Rockfin will get that as well. This weekend, Matt and I will be releasing our little visit to Cryptoland, so you won't want to miss that either. So
it's going to be fun.
Sign up, support the show to get access to all of that. And I'll see you on the other side.
See you, folks.